Hi, everyone. Today, what we're going to do, following a brief recap of our last class, we're going to turn our attention to the first book of our semester. We'll be getting into Leroux's Unequal Childhoods. And in doing so, we'll be looking at two subtopics. We'll be looking at both race and social class in Leroux's book. So today, a recap of last class, a little bit of background into race and social class, and then we'll get into Leroux. And when we get to Leroux, I'll go over the guidelines for the book report with you. So the guidelines for the report are posted in the content section, and I'll take some time today to go through the guidelines with you. So just to get started, last class we looked at the subtopic of gender. So in sociology, we believe that gender is a separate concept from sex. So when we refer to sex, we're looking at the biological male, biological female. And then when we talk about gender, we're looking at ideas of masculinity, ideas of femininity. So they're separate concepts, but they are related in the sense that we often assume femininity with women and we assume masculinity with men. So in addition to those distinctions, we also recognize gender as something that people do. It's not something you have, but rather it's a performance. So you're exposed to that gender culture, you learn ideas of masculinity, femininity, and then once you learn those ideas, you give the performance that's expected out of you. So here, girls begin to act like girls, boys begin to act like boys, and you start to distance yourself away from traits that are considered to be of the other sex. So this idea was talked about in the chapter we read for last class, in the sense that if you look at cultural socialization, one aspect of that socialization is being socialized in gendered ways. So again, gender is part of a culture, and ideas of gender will vary from one place to another. But nevertheless, every culture has ideas of gender. You're exposed to those ideas, and then you learn them. And once you learn them, you start to do gender. So again, it's nothing innate, it's nothing inborn, but rather it's a learned performance. And so we talked about this doing of gender in the last in-class assignment, making the biological social. So, I talked about the example of leg hair, how everybody has leg hair, but when we expect one sex to do one thing with it, shave it, one sex to do something else, keep it, then you create a difference between the sexes, a difference that does not initially exist. So, there are many examples you could go through. Eyebrows, everybody has eyebrows, but we expect women to kind of keep them neat, and we don't expect guys to care for their eyebrows. They can just kind of grow and get a little messy. We could look at armpit hair. Again, everybody has armpit hair. That in our culture, we believe women should shave it and guys should keep it. How we dress, again, is something that we just kind of take for granted. But how we dress definitely is gendered in terms of, what people wear, how they wear it. You can look at piercings, what type of piercings, where you get those piercings. So again, just all these things that we do to our bodies, fingernails, if you paint them or if you don't. All these things are nothing natural, but rather things that we learn through gender socialization. And once we give those performances, we are creating a difference between the sexes that does not initially exist. So when looking at our two subtopics we're going to be going through in Leroux's book, we'll start with race, a little bit of background into race, and then we'll get into social class. So we can say a race represents a social category of people who share biological traits. And these traits are often a skin tone, kind of hair type, facial features. So we kind of, based upon those traits, we lump people into a socially constructed category of race. And these categories and race itself is something fluid. So for example, at the beginning of our country, if you had roots in Italy or if you're Irish, you're considered to be non-white. You weren't white, you were kind of mixed or considered to be other. And today, if you have the hair type, the skin tone, and you happen to be of, Irish or Italian ancestry, today you are considered to be white. So again, it's fluid, and these meanings can change over time. And we see this with the U.S. Census, how in 1850, we had basically three racial categories: a mixed category, black and white categories. Jump up to 1880, 30 years later, now we have white, black, Chinese, mixed, and Indian. So we had Chinese, we had Indian individuals in the United States back in 1850. We just didn't have a category for them yet. They were kind of lumped in the mixed category. If you go to the year 2000 census, now you have 14 different racial choices. So it's not like people are migrating to the United States. It's not like people are kind of having sexual relations with one another and creating new races. Rather, we simply create them socially. Race is a socially constructed category, and you can create as many categories or as few categories as you want. And you kind of see that's develop over time. So not only over time does race change, ideas of race change from place to place. So if you look at South Africa, they have four main racial categories: white, black, colored, Indian. If you go to Brazil, they have white, brown, brunette, mulatto, black, yellow. So to them in Brazil, all these categories are perfectly normal, like natural ways of thinking about race. But again, if you compare them to South Africa or to the United States, we have different categories because we constructed those categories differently. So you can find to be a little bit confusing for somebody who perhaps is considered to be African American in the United States, and they perhaps would go to Brazil, and people would say, "Oh, you're brown." No, I'm not brown. I'm considered to be black back home. Or somebody who's from Brazil and is considered to be brunette comes to the U.S., they'd be probably considered to be black. So again, it's not nobody's right or wrong necessarily. This just captures that socially constructed nature of race and how it changes over time, and it changes from place to place. And also we can recognize the social psychological importance of race. So kind of culture provides meanings to different racial categories. So in other words, we attach certain meanings to every category. And those meanings, once we learn them, we use those meanings to kind of see people associated with the category. So not only is somebody part of a racial category, we define those categories and use those definitions to see the individuals. And that can shape not only how we see them perception-wise, but that can also shape what we expect out of them. So again, kind of relatively speaking, compared to other racial categories, we think of whites in the United States as being unathletic compared to other categories. And again, it's simply kind of a meaning we attach to whites. And when we have that meaning, we kind of expect that out of them. We're surprised when they're very athletic. We're surprised, when they can jump high. And so those expectations, are attached to, every racial category based upon the meanings we attach to the categories. And that can also influence our judgments of people. Simple sociological studies have shown that, if you look at resumes and the exact same resume of an individual who's applying for a job, but you simply just change the race of the individual, then you actually judge the application, you actually judge the resume differently according to kind of those meanings we associate with the racial category as a whole. So yes, on the one hand, race is simply a social constructed category, but race is much more than that because of the meanings we attach to each category and how we use those meanings to see, to kind of expect and to judge individuals. And so in getting into race and class, basically we can define class in LaRoe's book as a category based upon income and total assets. We can distinguish income and assets by saying that class, basically in terms of income, is the money that you're making in terms of wages for a job, in terms of the salary you're paid, in terms of any kind of bonuses you acquire. And that's basically all lumped into the category of income. And then assets, on the other hand, I like to think of basically potential money. And basically, assets are things that you own, things that you possess that you can cash in on if you need to. So here we're looking at, stocks. So if you have a lot of stocks, they're basically, worthless until you sell your stock and then you get money from it. Another form of asset you think of are cars, homes, things that you own. And again, they're potential money. Your house isn't, doing anything for you financially speaking until you sell your house. Your car is not doing anything for you money-wise until you actually sell it. So all assets are potential money, and you can think of assets as basically things that we own that we could sell if we ever find ourselves in a bind. So those two together create one's class. Often when we think of class, kind of symbolically, we think of lifestyle, how a person lives their lives in terms of their consumption patterns, what they buy to wear, what they buy to drive, lifestyle in terms of where you live, in terms of place and neighborhood. So those two things are connected when we talk about lifestyle and class. Interpretation here, basically, a lot of the times people actually misinterpret, what class to actually fall into, formally speaking. And what you see, often wealthy people don't like to see themselves as wealthy, so they'll say, "Oh, I'm in the middle class," when actuality, they're very wealthy. Or we have people that say, "Oh, I'm in the middle class," but in actuality, they're in the working class. So wealthy people, and it's a rule of thumb, not everybody, tend to kind of downsize their class when in actuality they're higher. And more non-wealthy people tend to upgrade their class when in actuality they'd be part of kind of a lower class bracket. So one last thing, when we talk about class position in the United States, there's this kind of American ideal that classes are very fluid. If you work hard enough, you can move up classes, or if you don't work hard, you move down in classes. Although you can see class mobility, as we call that, class reproduction is much more prevalent. And when we say class reproduction, classes tend to reproduce themselves. You're born into a certain class, the odds are more likely than not you're going to stay in that social class. So classes reproduce themselves. Working class people stay working class down the future. Middle class stay in the middle class. Upper class stays in the upper class. That's what we mean by class reproduction. And I wanted to bring that up now because that ties into LaRoe's book. She's looking at how race and class come together to shape parenting practices, and how those parenting practices in turn contribute to class reproduction. So that's that focus we'll get into. Before we get into the focus and the main parenting styles that she found in her research, let us take a couple minutes to go through the guidelines for book report number 1. So in book report number 1, we're looking at the due date being September 29th. So just like your other assignments, it's due at 10 p.m. That night. Always feel free to send me drafts that you have, whether it be a full draft that you finished beforehand, whether it be just a partial paper that you're still working on, but you'd like me to maybe look at the first part of it. I'm more than happy to do so. So the paper is worth 80 points, and I allocate those 80 points according to 1, 2, 3, and 4. 10 points for length, 20 points for part 2 of the paper, part 3 of the paper, 30 points, part 4 of the paper, 20 points. So if you add it all up, 10 plus 20 equals 30, 30 plus 30 equals 60, 20 plus 60 equals 80 points. So that's what we're looking at with the book report. And it is one of the kind of larger grades that you get. So that's why you want to, do well on it. So you set yourself up for getting a high grade at the end of the semester. So to start looking at the guidelines, make sure that you're citing the book. And by citing the book, basically, anytime you're using an idea from the book, you need to show the reader where that information is coming from. And basically, you cite it by the author's last name, the year of publication, and then that page number. So if you're citing something from, page 9, whether it be a direct quote that you use in your paper or just an idea that you're taking from that paper, a paraphrase, and then you're going to cite it, page 9 in LaRoe's book. And so you cite the literature when you write papers for two reasons. First, because you want to avoid plagiarism. Secondly, you want to show the reader where you can find this information. So if I read your paper, oh, that's an interesting quote, or that's an interesting idea, where could I go into the book to actually find that information for myself and do further reading? So make sure that you're citing everything when you're talking about it throughout your paper. And the papers themselves should be 3 full pages, double spaced. And then for part 2, we're looking at the author's position on what's more important in terms of shaping parenting styles. Is race more important or social class? So although LaRoe looks at both, she ultimately selects one, saying this is more important in terms of what shapes parenting compared to the other one. So make sure you kind of highlight which of the two, race or class, matters most when it comes to parenting, and then explain why. Why is this that, one variable or the other has more influence on why people parent in the way they do compared to the other variable. So the next part of the paper is kind of the heart of the paper, how LaRoe supports her thesis. She looks at kind of 3 different parts of parenting, and we'll get into all those parts when we get through our lectures and when you go through your books. Basically, look at the table of contents, and you'll see kind of the main ways that she breaks up her thesis and how she supports it. And we'll kind of break up our lectures in the same way. So identify those 3 ways that she kind of connects social class to parenting. And then for each, come up with an example that kind of shows this connection. So, here, for example, what we'll talk about in our next class, she says that social class has an influence in terms of how you organize a kid's day, throughout the kid's, week. So basically, daily life organization in terms of how you organize your kid's life is shaped by class. So you provide an example of how this actually works. And then you talk about why class actually matters. So again, this is basically what we're going to be doing, throughout our lectures, but it's kind of the big part of the paper. The 3 main connections between class and parenting, and why class actually matters in that relationship. So finally, for number 4, what you're going to look at is how race ties into parenting. So again, she looks at both class and race. For part 3 of the paper, you focus on class. And for the last part of your paper, I ask you to come up with one example of a connection between race and parenting. How can race influence how a parent raises their kid? So you come up with an example of that, and then you explain, this is why race matters in this situation. So that's that for now. And, I'll be coming back to this throughout our lectures. And definitely we'll be talking about your paper during some of those live sessions that we're going to be having over the next couple of weeks. But turning our attention back to your reading for today, it's basically the first couple chapters, an introduction to the book. We can say that the focus of the book, again, we're going to look at these 2 variables, class and race, and how these variables shape parenting styles. And the parenting styles are kind of the cultural aspects we're looking at. Every culture kind of has their ways of kind of raising kids. So how does one's class, how does one's race kind of shape that cultural way, parenting styles? And then again, in turn, how do these parenting styles contribute to the reproduction of social inequality? So, it makes sense if you think about class reproduction, why people stay in the same class. Money is one reason. If you have money to pass down to your kid, that sets them up to do well in the future. They can pass down their millions to their kid, and the kid's going to be wealthy. Or on the other hand, if you can't pass down any wealth, then your kid's going to be up against it in terms of climbing that class ladder. So it makes sense. But here we're looking at more kind of invisible mechanisms in play and that lead to class reproduction, and different cultural styles of parenting, and how the consequences of those parenting styles contributes to class reproduction. Lower class kids staying in the lower class, upper class kids staying in the upper class. So that's the main focus, and we'll kind of narrow this focus down as we go through the book and get to the main thesis, her main argument as we do that. So secondly, we need to be familiar with the two main parenting styles. So Lareau and her team of researchers, observed families and kind of interviewed families. And through the research, they found that two different patterns emerge. One parenting style they call concerted cultivation. And often during lecture, I'll call that CC, and just to save time and breath. And then the second parenting style, she calls the accomplishment of natural growth, what we can call NG. So these are two different parenting styles that emerge in the research. And to understand what those two parenting styles are, we can start to look at different characteristics of each. So the last slide today, I just want to spend a couple minutes on breaking down the two parenting styles, concerted cultivation and natural growth, in terms of the different characteristics that comprise them and make them different from one another. So one parenting style is connected to the middle/upper class, and that's the concerted cultivation style. So when we think of the middle class, when you think of upper class families, we need to think of concerted cultivation. Likewise, when we think of concerted cultivation, we need to be thinking of the middle and upper class families and how they're doing the parenting. When we talk about natural growth parenting style, we're talking about people from a working class, people from a poorer background. And so the idea simply is that the class position and the resources attached to those class positions, such as money, time, kind of life experience, all these things contribute to parenting in one way or another. And so the NG style is connected to a lower class, working class family. The CC style is connected to a middle, upper class family. And so other characteristics, free time. Free time, we're looking at how much time a kid has on her or his hands. Do they have a lot of free time to kind of do what they want to do? Or do they have a lot of structured time, meaning that they have a lot of things scheduled for them on a weekly basis? So again, we're not trying to say that one kid has all free time and the other kid doesn't, but there is a difference where one kid's schedule is full compared to the other kid's schedule that's relatively open. And so the relatively open schedule, the kid with more free time in comparison to the other kids, is the NG parenting style. The NG kids tend to have not too many scheduled activities, so they have a lot of free time on their hands as a result. That's compared to the CC kids, the middle and upper class kids. They have a lot of scheduled activities throughout the week, and the scheduled activities take up a lot of their time. Thus, they're going to be lacking free time. So we can break down two other things. Parents, in terms of trying to foster reasoning, create reasoning in their kids. So this looks like, and we'll talk about all of these further as we go through the book, but the parent has the kid kind of explain what they're trying to say. The kid has to justify why he or she believes one thing or another. In other families, you don't see that kind of back and forth as much. Rather, is more black and white direction. The parent basically says to a kid, do this or don't do that, and there's little talk back from the kid. So this kind of, one-way street, kind of the black and white directions, is more often found in the NG parenting style, where the kind of communication development, the reasoning skills being developed, is more often found in the CC parenting style. So again, we'll talk about the reasons for this, why class resources connected to CC or NG families creates reasoning or creates more black and white directions in terms of the parenting styles. So we can look at institutional involvement or institutional distance. And by these things, we're looking at how involved is a parent, how involved are parents in their kids' institutions, such as the kids' sports they're playing, such as the kids' schooling. So if we say there's institutional distance, it means that the parent only does what he or she needs to do. So they kind of just do what's asked of them. They're doing the minimum. Where on the other hand, the CC, well, that's related to the NG families. And when we say institutional involvement, we're looking at the CC families, and they kind of go above and beyond what's asked of them. They're heavily involved in their kids' activities, their kids' institutions. So we can look at two other things, two other characteristics: spheres with adults. And so if you share a sphere with an adult, basically you're around an adult all the time, whether it be a parent, whether it be a teacher, whether it be a coach or an instructor. There's always a parent, an authority figure kind of around you. On the other hand, if you say separate spheres, usually the kids are, around other kids, or the kids are, by themselves. And what we see when the kids are separated from adults more often than not, that's part of the kind of NG parenting. And when the kids are closely connected to adults, when you have that same spheres, that's part of the CC parenting style. So finally, when you kind of add everything up at the end of the day, Laurel argues that the different parenting styles create different social psychologies in the kids. Often the NG kids get a feeling and a sense of constraint, and that it's kind of me against the world, and there's a lot of obstacles I have to go through. So you just kind of feel everything's kind of against you, and you kind of fight in your battles as you go through life. Apologize for that. And on the other hand, in the CC kids, they develop a sense of entitlement. So it's not me against the world, but the world is mine, and I can do whatever I want with it. I deserve everything that I want, rather than have to work for it. So, those are things that we'll talk about throughout the book. But now I just wanted to leave it at kind of recognizing how to approach the book, what's going on in terms of the focus, and also the two main parenting styles, and its different characteristics that contribute to those different parenting styles. So I'll leave that there for today. As always, if you have any questions about the book or the book report guidelines, please reach out to me and let me know.